At first, the fact of being cut off from the outside world was accepted with more or less good grace, much as people would have put up with any other temporary inconvenience that interfered with only a few of their habits. But now they had abruptly become aware that they were undergoing a sort of incarceration under that blue dome of sky, already beginning to sizzle in the fires of summer. They had a vague sensation that their whole lives were threatened by the present turn of events, and in the evening, when the cooler air revived their energy, this feeling of being locked in like criminals prompted them sometimes to foolhardy acts. It is noteworthy, this may or may not have been due to mere coincidence, that this Sunday of the sermon marked the beginning of something like a widespread panic in the town, and it took so deep a hold as to lead one to suspect that only now had the true nature of their situation dawned on our townspeople. Seen from this angle, the atmosphere of the town was somewhat changed. But actually, it was a problem whether the change was in the atmosphere or in the hearts. A few days after the sermon, when Ryu, on his way to one of the outlying districts of the town, was discussing the change with Grand, he collided in the darkness with a man who was standing in the middle of the pavement, swaying from side to side without trying to advance. At the same moment, the street lamps, which were being lit later and later in the evening, went on suddenly, and a lamp just behind Ryu and his companion threw its light full on the man's face. His eyes were shut, and he was laughing soundlessly. Big drops of sweat were rolling down the face, convulsed with silent merriment. A lunatic at large, Grand observed. Ryu took his arm and was sheep-herding him on when he noticed that Grand was trembling violently. If things go on as they are going, Ryu remarked, the whole town will be like a madhouse. He felt exhausted. His throat was parched. Let's have a drink. Turned into a small cafe. The only light came from a lamp over the bar. The heavy air had a curious reddish tinge, and for no apparent reason, everyone was speaking in undertones. To the doctor's surprise, Grand asked for a glass of straight liquor, which he drank off at a gulp. Fiery stuff, he observed, then a moment later suggested making a move. Out in the street, it seemed to Ryu that the night was full of whispers. Somewhere in the black depths above the street lamps, there was a low soughing that brought to his mind that unseen flail threshing incessantly in the languid air, of which Panelo had spoken. Happily, Grand muttered, then paused. Ryu asked him what he had been going to say. Happily, I've my work. Ah, yes, Ryu said. That's something, anyhow. Then, so as not to hear that eerie whistling in the air, he asked Grand if he was getting good results. Well, yes, I think I'm making headway. Have you much more to do? Grand began to show an animation unlike his usual self, and his voice took ardor from the liquor he had drunk. I don't know, but that's not the point, Doctor. Yes, I can assure you, that's not the point. It was too dark to see clearly, but Ryu had the impression that he was waving his arms. He seemed to be working himself up to say something, and when he spoke, the words came out with a rush. What I really want, Doctor, is this. On the day when the manuscript reaches the publisher, I want him to stand up after he's read it through, of course, and say to his staff, "Gentlemen, hats off." Ryu was dumbfounded, and to add to his amazement, he saw, or seemed to see, the man beside him making as if to take off his hat with a sweeping gesture, bringing his hand to his head and holding his arm straight out in front of him. That queer whistling overhead seemed to gather force. So you see, Grand added, It's got to be flawless. Though he knew little of the literary world, Ryu had a suspicion that things didn't quite happen in it so picturesquely. That, for instance, publishers do not keep their hats on in their offices. But of course, one could never tell, and Ryu preferred to hold his peace. Try as he might to shut his ears to it, he still was listening to that eerie sound above, the whispering of the plague. They had reached the part of the town where Grand lived, and as it was on a slight eminence, they felt the cool night breeze fanning their cheeks, and at the same time carrying away from them the noises of the town. Grand went on talking, but Ryu failed to follow all the worthy man was saying. All he gathered was that the work he was engaged on ran to a great many pages, and he was at almost excruciating pains to bring it to perfection. Evenings, whole weeks spent on one word, just think, sometimes on a mere conjunction. Grand stopped abruptly and seized the doctor by a button of his coat. The words came stumbling out of his almost toothless mouth. I'd like you to understand, Doctor. I grant you it's easy enough to choose between a but and an and. It's a bit more difficult to decide between an and a then. But definitely the hardest thing may be to know whether one should put an and or leave it out. Yes, Ryu said. I see your point. He started walking again. Grand looked abashed, then stepped forward and drew level. Sorry, he said awkwardly. I don't know what's come over me this evening. Ryu patted his shoulder encouragingly, saying he'd been much interested in what Grand had said and would like to help him. This seemed to reassure Grand, and when they reached the place he suggested, after some slight hesitation, the doctor should come in for a moment. Ryu agreed. They entered the dining room, and Ryu gave him a chair beside a table strewn with sheets of paper covered with writing in a microscopic hand, crisscrossed with corrections. Yes, that's it, he said, in answer to the doctor's questioning glance. But won't you drink something? I've some wine. Ryu declined. He was bending over the manuscript. No, don't look, Grand said. It's my opening phrase. It's giving me trouble. No end of trouble. He too was gazing at the sheets of paper on the table, and his hand seemed irresistibly drawn to one of them. Finally, he picked it up and held it to the shadeless electric bulb so that the light shone through. The paper shook his hand, and Ryu noticed that his forehead was moist with sweat. Sit down, said he, and read it to me. Yes. There was a timid gratitude in Grand's eyes and smile. I think you'd like to hear it. He waited for a while, still gazing at the writing, then sat down. Meanwhile, Ryu was listening to the curious buzzing sound that was rising from the streets as if in answer to the sawings of the plague. At that moment, he had a preternaturally vivid awareness of the town stretched out below, a victim world, secluded and apart, and of the groans of agony stifled in its darkness. Then, pitched low but clear, Grand's voice came to his ears. One fine morning in the month of May, an elegant young horsewoman might have been seen riding a handsome sorrel mare along the flowery avenues of the Bois de Boulogne. Silence returned, and with it the vague murmur of the prostrate town. Grand had put down the sheet and was still staring at it. After a while, he looked up. What do you think of it? Ryu replied that this opening phrase had whetted his curiosity. He'd like to hear what followed. Whereat Grand told him he'd got it all wrong. He seemed excited and slapped the papers on the table with the flat of his hand. That's only a rough draft. Once I've succeeded in rendering perfectly the picture in my mind's eye, once my words have the exact tempo of this ride, the horses trotting, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, see what I mean? The rest will come more easily. And what's even more important, the illusion will be such that from the very first words, it will be possible to say, hats off. But before that, he admitted, there was a lot of hard work to be done. He'd never dreamt of handing that sentence to the printer in its present form. For though it sometimes satisfied him, he was fully aware it didn't quite hit the mark as yet, and also that to some extent it had a facility of tone approximating, remotely perhaps, but recognizably, to the commonplace. That was more or less what he was saying when they heard the sound of people running up the street below the window. Rue stood up. "Just wait and see what I make of it," Grand said, and glancing toward the window added, "when all this is over." But then the sound of hurried footsteps came again. Ryu was already halfway down the stairs, and when he stepped out into the street, 2 men brushed past him. They seemed to be on their way to one of the town gates. In fact, what with the heat and the plague, some of our fellow citizens were losing their heads. There had already been some scenes of violence, and nightly attempts were made to elude the sentries and escape to the outside.